Good evening, friends. We're delighted that you could join us this afternoon for JASA's annual holiday program. This has been a year filled with exciting special exhibitions of Japanese art throughout America, and we're delighted to look forward to the future of the important collection at the Princeton University Art Museum tonight, with the insights of its new Curator of Asian Art, Dr. Kit Brooks, who will speak about the collection and future directions we can expect to follow in the coming year. Kit Brooks joined the Princeton University Art Museum as Curator of Asian Art in May of this year. Previously, Kit had served as the Japan Foundation Assistant Curator of Japanese Art at the National Museum of Asian Art in Washington, D.C. Kit holds a PhD in Japanese art history from Harvard University, graduating in 2017, studying under Professors Yukio Lippert and Melissa McCormick. Dr. Brooks is also a graduate of the 2016 CCL Mellon Foundation Seminar in Curatorial Practice at the Center for Curatorial Leadership. Kit's recent exhibition projects include the print generation, currently on view at the National Museum of Asian Art, Staging the Supernatural, Ghosts and the Theater in Japanese Prints 2024, and Io's Happy Rainbow Hell of 2023, the first United States exhibition dedicated to the psychedelic Japanese Fluxus artist Io. Please join me to welcome Dr. Kit Brooks.
Thank you, Amy. Let me know if my screen isn't showing okay. Good evening, everyone, and happy holidays, however you choose to celebrate and whichever time zone or country you find yourself in right now. I know it looks like I'm in black and white, but I promise that my slides are not. I'm very grateful to JASA's planning committee for the invitation to speak tonight for the festive program, and I'm looking forward to sharing a little bit about what's to come for the Princeton University Art Museum in 2025. As you are probably now aware from the flyer for my talk, the university is getting a brand new museum, opening in the fall of next year, which includes a suite of galleries devoted to Asia, including significant square footage for the display of Japanese artworks. But before I start, I do need to give a disclaimer. As Amy mentioned, I only started in Princeton this past May, whereas planning the new museum has been years in the making. This means that everything I present to you tonight is the result of other people's hard work. In sharing these recent and past acquisitions, along with the gallery plans for where they will be displayed, I am basically committing the curatorial equivalent of stolen valor, and I deserve no credit whatsoever. For my part, I am very grateful for the achievements of Princeton's curators, past and present, and excited by the possibilities of the new space and everything that students and supporters will bring to the research, display, and appreciation of Japanese art in the future. But predictably, for art history, before we talk about the future, we need to talk about the past. And I hope you won't mind me speaking a little bit about the history of Asian art at Princeton to provide a context for everything that will follow. And perhaps some of you listening this evening will have some familiarity with the old building. That is the building that existed prior to it being demolished in 2021. However, that building was not actually very old in the grand scheme of things, and it was one of several forms that the museum has taken over the years, as the history of some type of a museum at Princeton dates as far back as the late 18th century. Once upon a time, Nassau Hall, which is still the emblematic building of the university and occupying a really central location on campus, it once housed everything: lecture rooms, dorms, faculty offices, and it also functions as a pseudo-museum, displaying a variety of natural history objects and ancient architectural fragments, in addition to two historical oil paintings. One, a portrait of the then governor of New Jersey, Jonathan Belcher, and two, a portrait of King George II. However, as several people have gleefully told me since I arrived, those two portraits were destroyed on New Year's Day of 1777 during the Revolutionary War against the British in the Battle of Princeton. Apparently, as British troops took over Nassau Hall, taking shelter behind the thick stone walls, In response, revolutionary American troops enveloped the building. A young Alexander Hamilton was among that group, and his unit began firing, and supposedly amongst that carnage, one round of artillery decapitated that portrait of King George. The hall was damaged, but soon rebuilt, and it continued to be used for housing objects for over 100 years after this moment. For those of us, all of us, interested in Japanese history, we all know the year 1868 as the date of the Meiji Restoration, signaling the end of the Tokugawa shogunate and the beginning of a new governmental era. But that year also holds significance for art history at Princeton as well. So in 1868, a new university president arrived, James McCosh, a Scottish philosopher who was given the formidable task of modernizing the university. As part of his transformative program, McCosh introduced several new disciplines from Europe, which were considered progressive at the time, such as the scandalous and degenerate field known as the history of art. This new discipline required a curriculum, and to help build one, McCosh enlisted a Princeton alumnus, William Cooper Prime, who was a journalist in New York, but also one of the founding trustees of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. McCosh also recruited the former Civil War general and the then governor of New Jersey, General George McClellan, to help formulate the curriculum. Prime and McClellan proposed that in order for students to properly study the history of art and archaeology, they would, naturally, need direct access to original artworks. They proposed the founding of a trio of entities, a department with faculty for the teaching of art and archaeology, a library to support the research of those topics, and a museum in which to house artworks for study. In 1883, Alan Marquand was appointed as the founder and the first professor of Princeton's Art and Archaeology faculty. Marquand had graduated from Princeton in 1874, but he returned as a professor of Latin and logic before he was appointed to the art history department. Marquand is also known for having built an electromagnetic logic machine in the 1880s, an early computer, which is still held in the university's Marquand Library, and that library is, of course, named for the man himself. One of the oldest art libraries in the US, Marquand still serves as the art history library for the university. And today there are about 500,000 volumes, but initially the collection was started with art history books that Marquand paid for himself. And you may be wondering why this early computer engineer and scholar of Latin became Princeton's first art history professor. Well, it seems that the university president, James McCosh, who was a philosopher himself, didn't exactly quite approve of the unorthodox way that Marquand taught logic, and so he might have wanted him out of that department. But moreover, Marquand's father was an art collector and one of the founders of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And those might seem like dubious qualifications for an art history professor, but Marquand clearly grew into the role, as he is now regarded as one of the foremost art historians of his time, with a focus on Italian Renaissance sculpture. And so now there was a library, admittedly a small one, and a faculty, admittedly of one person, but still, and William Cooper Prime's plan for the third component, a museum, also came to fruition in the 1880s. So up until this point, what is now the faculty room in Nassau Hall had served as the university's first museum space, resembling other Enlightenment galleries of the period, where works of art, archaeology, and natural history were displayed side by side. The Battle of Princeton a few years prior had, well, almost 100 years prior, had incinerated all of the art and antiquarian works inside, along with a fire a few years later. And although the hall had been rebuilt, it was not up to the standards that a repository of art required and that Prime demanded. Prime had offered to donate his collection of over 500 ceramics if a proper museum could be built to house them. The college's trustees began soliciting funds for a fireproof building, and by 1886-7, around a dozen donors had contributed just over $40,000. They had commissioned the American architect A. Page Brown to design the museum, but 40 grand was not enough to fulfill Brown's entire plan, which had included a central section, but adding 2 projecting wings and a lecture hall in the back. However, their donations were just enough to construct the central core in a Romanesque revival style. And by 1890, the modest three-story building was complete. Although small, this building, which was then known as the Museum of Historic Art, was for many years nevertheless somehow able to accommodate the museum, the art history department, the fine arts library, and a newly created School of Architecture. So Alan Marquand was appointed as the museum's first director, and the inaugural collection was indeed donated by William Cooper Prime, that architect of the grand plan for a trifecta of art institutions at Princeton. The same year as the museum was finished, 1890, Prime donated the Trumbull Prime collection, which was jointly collected by Prime and his wife, Mary Trumbull. And although this was undoubtedly an important and a generous gift, the Trumbull Prime collection contains quite a high proportion of mostly antiquarian material and export ware, particularly for Asian art, and it only contains a handful of what we might consider to be museum quality pieces today. However, it is reflective of the time period and the understanding of Asian art that was current at that time. There are 4 Japanese ceramics in the Trumbull Prime collection, including these 2 barber's basins made of Arita-ware porcelain for the export market, which again is typical of the collection as a whole. We can notice a slight shift in Princeton's collection of Japanese art with the acquisition of the Morse collection in 1905, donated by the family of William Forrest Morse. And Morse's 2 sons were both Princeton graduates, which explains his connection to the university. But Morse himself had spent about 30 years working and traveling in Japan when he was employed by a trading company. And it was over the course of many years that he assembled a collection of Japanese objects, including over 120 netsuke that he donated to Princeton. And although these were not produced for a foreign market, netsuke were and are popular with foreign collectors, appreciated as miniature sculptures that are kind of quite apart from their role as personal adornments and the contexts of sartorial regulations and circumventions in the Edo period. The second director of the museum, and don't worry, I'm not going to go through them all, the second director, Frank Jewett Martha Jr., oversaw the first of many expansions that the museum would undergo, and it has been through many more changes since then. But the site of Arthur Page Brown's first museum in 1890 is the same location as the museum has occupied ever since, which includes its new 2025 iteration. So you won't get lost if you're trying to find your way to the old museum. Mather wasn't impressed by the museum that he had inherited, and he wanted to expand it in size and scope. In his words, he found himself presiding over the oddest kingdom of shreds and patches imaginable, end quote. In 1923, McCormick Hall was added to the west side of the building in this Venetian Gothic style, but the museum's collection and the faculty's range of teaching also expanded under Mather's tenure. Although he joined the faculty in 1925 as a specialist of Italian painting, Professor George Rowley came to devote his life to the teaching of Japanese and Chinese art, and those were the first programs in those fields at an American university. The next director, Ernest DeWald, was also one of the so-called monuments men who had been charged with protecting the cultural heritage of Europe during World War II. And DeWald seems like he was quite a character. He was passionate about conservation to the extent that he personally cleaned paintings in his own office on the top floor of the museum. And that's something that would just cause conniptions among conservation staff today. To mark the university's bicentennial in 1946, DeWald refurbished the galleries, and that included adding space for the display of Chinese scrolls. He was a great supporter of Asian art, and that was an area of collecting that he was greatly assisted in by the first specially appointed professor of East Asian art and art history, Wen Fong, who would go on to become the founding director of the Met's Asian department, having established the first doctoral program of Chinese art and archaeology in the US at Princeton. Fong's impact is vast, and his students are too numerous to mention, but I will mention Dr. Kerry Liu, recently retired, who for many years was the curator of Asian art at the museum here and is still very much a vital part of the community. On a sabbatical trip to Japan in the late 1950s, Wen Fong first met the Japanese art historian Shimada Shujiro, a specialist in ink painting, who would later teach at Princeton until his return in Japan in 1978. Amongst other students, Shimada was the advisor to the late Yoshiaki Shimizu, who would go on to be a Princeton faculty member for over 20 years. And Professor Shimizu advised a whole generation of Japanese art history specialists in the US, through which many of us, including myself, can trace our academic lineages. In the 1960s, that old Arthur Page Brown building was demolished to make way for a new building in a more utilitarian style, which was completed in 1966. But in 1989, the then director Alan Rosenbaum led another expansion, this time of a new wing, to provide additional exhibition space, a conservation studio, as well as seminar and study storage rooms for all areas of the museum's collection. Which finally brings us to now. As the museum is not finished, I hope you don't mind, but I will mostly be showing renderings rather than photographs. In 2020, the Ghanaian British architect David Adjaye was commissioned to design the new museum, which at 144,000 square feet, or 13,400 square meters if you're metric, is double the size of the previous museum, although it is in the same location. The new museum is 3 stories with 9 interconnected pavilions, and here is a different angle that shows 2 of these pavilions, including the Asian one. The pavilions are slightly different sizes, but essentially they are in 3 rows of 3, like a tic-tac-toe grid. One of the pavilions is occupied by the Markman Library, which also has not moved. And construction of the new museum began in the summer of 2021, but as many of you may be aware, in 2023, several former employees brought allegations of sexual assault and harassment against the commissioned architect David Adjaye. The building was more than 50% complete by this time, and the construction was by then being overseen by a different executive architecture firm, Cooper Robertson, who actually oversee the construction of the building. The museum's leadership decided to go ahead with the building as planned, and Adjaye has withdrawn from many public-facing roles in this and many other of his buildings designed by his firm that were already underway at the time that the allegations surfaced. This is undoubtedly a topic that will be grappled with for many years to come, just as we reflect on the problematic and abusive figures in our own historical research and communities. The museum is in a central location on campus, but instead of walking around it, it is hoped that students will walk through it to get across campus, as there are north-south and east-west corridors that are being referred to as art walks, which cut across the first floor. The first floor of the museum contains classrooms, lecture halls, and object study rooms. The second floor of the pavilions contains the galleries, and the third floor is for staff officers, both museum staff and the art history faculty. And there is also a restaurant for the first time in the museum's history. You can just see the opening to one of the art walks here, which cuts right through the building. The art walks will be open every day until midnight. So even though the students can't be in the galleries with the artwork in the middle of the night, they can see some of it, as there are also these embedded mosaics in the floor that you can walk over, and some other artworks on display in cases lining those art walks. And hopefully this means that the building will become a very familiar part of student life on campus, even if a majority of students are not majoring or minoring in art history themselves. I have received special permission to share some renderings with you this evening, which haven't previously been shared outside of the museum, so I hope that you will enjoy a sneak peek of those. And this will be the view as you come into the Asia Pavilion. But one word of caution, much as my camera is being very odd this evening, these renderings are lightened for visibility in the planning process, but the actual space itself and the colors that you see in these images will not be quite this bright in real life. The pavilion is about 4,000 square feet, and additionally the galleries immediately outside the pavilion are also devoted to the display of Asian art. Among other formats, there will also be plenty of space for the display of hand scrolls and seating to encourage long and slow looking. And for those who remember the old building, the Asia galleries used to be in the basement. And don't get me wrong, I love a good basement. I am naturally reclusive and I don't like daylight. But the Asian Pavilion will now be among the first suites of galleries that visitors encounter after coming up the stairs onto the second floor, which is a marked increase in terms of the visibility and exposure to Asian art for our visitors. And my brilliant colleague, Zoe Kwok, has also positioned this polyresin sculpture by the Asian American artist Danny Young in a vitrine case just outside the Asia Pavilion, pointing to the entrance just in case visitors need another clue about exactly where they should visit first. And I can't show you everything that will be on display on opening day, as I don't want to spoil the surprise, and I do hope that you will all visit us next year. Of course, there will be tiger-themed artworks for the reopening celebrations, as tigers are the Princeton mascot and very prominent all over campus. For Japan, these tiger and bamboo screens will be on display on opening day, and our gallery platform for folding screens means that they will be exhibited without glass between them and the visitor, allowing for a better appreciation of the physicality of these types of objects, and the details of their surfaces and their textures will be much better appreciated. So I've been on the construction site twice so far, once during the summer and once was actually just this last Friday. And you'll notice that there is a lot of this composite concrete, which is probably not going to be to everyone's taste aesthetically. However, these materials are apparently amazing for climate control, which is the priority in caring for these artworks. And the building itself is actually carbon neutral, a front runner among campus buildings, as the whole campus is set to be carbon neutral by 2030. Additionally, I have noticed from being in the space that this material is incredibly sound dampening, which I'm sure will be much appreciated if you're trying to teach in the classrooms in the center of campus, and also to allow for quiet viewing in the galleries. Most of the pavilions allow for natural light to enter the galleries through this ceiling arrangement, but this does not include the Asian galleries, you'll be pleased to hear. The high light sensitivity of East Asian works on paper and silk mean that this effect is instead simulated and the light levels are closely controlled. We will have the same high ceilings as the other galleries that do admit the natural light. But what you can't really see in these photos is that there is actually a lot of wood throughout the building, not only in the ceiling beams, but in banisters, in panels, and other features. There are even some smaller gallery spaces that are entirely wood, so walls, floor, and ceiling. But the concrete went in first, and the wood has only been added just recently. And unfortunately, I can only show you the photos that have been officially approved by our PR staff. So I just wanted to mention that architectural feature, as it might not be readily apparent, especially if you've only seen the outside of the building. But this renewed focus on ecologically conscious material and energy systems will also be manifest in the museum's exhibitions over the years, and my own growing interest in the field of eco art history is something that I very happily share with my counterpart in Princeton's faculty, Professor Rachel Saunders, who has recently just joined us from the Harvard Art Museums. A topic in this vein that I have become more interested in over the past few years is the culture of fire in Edo and its impact as visible in artworks. And I'm thrilled that this is an area that I can continue to think through using the collection here at Princeton. So during her tenure here as a curator, our colleague Dr. Xiaojin Wu acquired this knockout painting by Kobayashi Kiyochika of an inferno at Ryogoku Bridge. This painting is a depiction of a real fire, which occurred on the 26th of January, 1881, a well-known and documented event in Kiyochika's life. The painting is larger than you might expect. It's over 1 meter across, and it also features beautiful gold detailing and these other gorgeous moments, like this purple tinge to the clouds that makes it flush almost like a bruise. Aside from using expensive pigments to depict something so destructive, what makes this painting even more memorable is that Kiyochika is known to have made sketches of the fire at Ryogoku Bridge, even as his own home and studio were burning down, and also apparently as his wife was leaving him. Kiyochika's home studio was totally destroyed in this fire, so we are encouraged to imagine the artist's own possessions burning in this scene that is so carefully depicted for us here. The sense of immediacy is overwhelming. As viewers, we stand just behind the city's firefighters, who are identifiable by their thick, padded, indigo-dyed coats and their matoi standards, which we use to identify the various firefighting groups. And firefighters played an important role in the fabric of Edo society. A popular saying held that fires and fights were the pride of Edo, and with the frequent earthquakes and city architecture that was made of wood and paper, fires were a major event, and several major fires punctuated the history of the city, including the 1881 fire at Ryogoku, which is depicted here. And I realized that Professor Henry Smith may be in the audience, and Professor Smith has written on Kiyochika's depiction of the destruction of his studio and the Ryogoku Bridge, and the sketches of that fire that remain among Kiyochika's extant sketchbooks. The fire occurred at about 1:30 on the morning of Wednesday, January the 26th, and it jumped across the Sumida River at about 9 a.m., eventually burning for around 16 hours and destroying approximately 10,000 buildings. Just over 2 weeks later, a different fire occurred, which is depicted here on the right of the screen, and that burned down the Meiji Theatre, and Kiyochika sketched that as well. But as the view in the painting doesn't resemble a sketch by Kiyochika that is known, it appears that Kiyochika is combining the memories of the different fires and projecting it onto an imagined scene, positioning us on top of a burning roof to add that sense of immediacy. This sense of immersion is encouraged by the pattern that's on the mounting fabric, which amplifies these visions of rising clouds and of choking smoke. There is another depiction of Ryogoku Bridge in the collection, this time with a much more familiar, less destructive, and more entertaining incarnation of fire that is so often depicted at this location, fireworks. And fireworks have been associated with Ryogoku Bridge ever since 1733, when the Shogun Tokugawa Yoshimune commissioned a special fireworks display as part of a purification rite / memorial service for recent victims of starvation that had been caused by a cacophony of natural disasters, including crop failures, plague, and an epidemic of cholera that had all occurred over the preceding year. But this undeniably joyous night scene shows beautiful men and women on pleasure boats that crowd the wide Sumida River, with throngs of people on the busy bridge. The scene is capped with this pitch black night, illuminated by bright pinpricks of light as the fireworks burst overhead. Although Ryogoku and fireworks are very familiar to us, this painting probably is not. It was acquired by the Tang Center for the museum in 2011, and the Tang Center is a branch of art history at Princeton that was not anticipated by William Cooper Prime. Established in 2001, the P.Y. and Kinmei W. Tang Center for East Asian Art aims to promote the understanding of East Asian art through scholarly programming and publications, but also through supporting strategic purchases for the museum. And this painting by a little-known painter, Kishi Chozen, shows the unusual subject of a fire at night. It's an extraordinary type of silhouette painting, with these almost ethereal figures moving about in the dark. There is what looks like a drunken man being led back home by two women, one on either side, probably after too much partying. But there are also many figures carrying the lanterns, the ladders, and the Tobaguchi hooks that firefighters would use to demolish at-risk buildings and therefore prevent the spread of fire. There are watchtowers and upright ladders mounted by lone firefighters as the rest of their team scramble into action below. There are lots of details in this painting which warrants very careful looking, and the mounting is also really interesting. The thin strip of ornamental fabric at the top of the painting features these large roundel patterns that appear South Asian in origin. But in addition to that decorative effect, I can't help but be reminded of these large standards, the matoi, carried by the different firefighting troops in the Edo period. And although the soft pink light on the horizon might initially suggest that this is a painting of dawn, a different focus to this scene emerges. That moment before a crisis when some people know what is happening and are rushing to action, while others are unaware, going about their business in the early morning light, wrapped up in their own lives. Although this painting may not have the same personal resonance as Kiyoshika's depiction, there is clearly an attempt at accuracy here, as we can be sure of specific locations. The bridge that is in the center of the painting is the Edo Bridge, and to the right-hand edge, the Nihon Bridge, which is located in a merchant district and surrounded by warehouses, so these white-fronted buildings. The location in the painting that is the locus of the fire and the great clouds of smoke has therefore been identified as Aoyama in the southwestern part of Edo. And very diligent scholars have mapped and documented the major fires that devastated Edo during this period, and it is speculated that the painting is a depiction of a specific fire, the Aoyama fire, which occurred on the 24th day of the first month of 1845. And that identification has given rise to the proposed dating of the painting as having been completed that same year. This was a very destructive fire, which eventually spread from the southwest to the western part of the city, and it incinerated vast areas of land and caused the deaths of approximately 900 people. But for the size of the fire, that number of casualties seems fairly low, and it may be precisely because of an early alarm being raised, signaled in the painting by these watchtowers and the firefighters who are standing as lookouts on these tall vertical ladders. And maybe that's what enabled so many people to escape to safety. This painting may also give us an insight into the practicalities of firefighting strategy. The firefighters are forming into groups, which are each clustered around an identifying Matoi banner, and they seem to be directed by city officials who are riding on horseback, who carry lanterns. And it may be that the guards in the towers and on the ladders are providing further direction from their high vantage points over the city. And moving closer to the action, we see firefighters running towards the blaze, armed with the hooked poles that would be used to demolish at-risk buildings. So despite the canals that crisscross the city, water pumps were not used to fight fires until the late 19th century. Instead, firefighters would quickly disassemble buildings in the fire's path to create fire breaks, which would deprive the approaching fire of fuel and stop it in its tracks. Areas next to rivers and bridges were especially important for this task and targeted as demolition zones. If the fire's path could not be brought to a halt before a river, and the burning embers were swept across the water, a whole new district of the city would now be on fire. And this is perhaps the painter's motivation for including the bridges and the canals as the central focus of the painting. And little is known about the identity of this painter, but it's hoped that with more research we will uncover more details about his training and practice. And as I mentioned, this is one of the artworks in the museum whose acquisition was sponsored by the Tang Center. And the center will be celebrating its 25th anniversary in the spring of 2026. So please mark your calendars and stay tuned, as we will have lots of programming for East Asian art at that time. So since the museum has been closed to the public since 2019, there has not been an opportunity to show new acquisitions. I'm making this talk into just such an opportunity, and I wanted to start with this twofold screen, donated to the museum in 2021 by Lynn and Jack Dodick. You may recognize this work as an image, the image on the e-flyer for tonight's event, and I selected this work for its symbolic message of fecundity and auspiciousness, all the things that I wish for all of you going into the new year. It shows a two-wheeled black lacquered cart with gilt decoration, and although the cart is loaded with different vessels containing realistically painted flowers, it is not a realistic scene, as the depicted species of flowers bloom in different seasons. They include pink and white peonies, irises, sunflowers, wisteria, chrysanthemums, lilies, clematis, and camellias. The two cart shafts rest on a lacquered stand adorned by a looped red cord, and we have to imagine the oxen that would pull this cart and to where it might be headed. The painter of this screen, Kano Eike, was the son and pupil of the well-known Kyoto Kano painter and the compiler of that formidable Kano treatise, the Honcho Gashi. Eike would succeed his father to become the fourth generation head of the Kyoto branch of the Kano school. However, the motif of a flower cart as a painting subject was established, like so many others, by an earlier Kannō painter, Kannō Tanyu. And in 1633, Tanyu was commissioned to paint a flower cart on the wooden doors of a hall in Nagoya Castle, and my apologies for the black and white image here. And after this point, an image of a flower cart was painted on wooden doors in palaces and mansions, seemingly tied to the practice of ikebana flower arranging. And now someone in the audience who knows far more about ikebana than I do may correct me on this point, but it seems that the flowers in Eike's cart are arranged in the standing flower or rika style, which was originally associated with ritual decoration, but from the early 17th century had been appropriated as an art practiced by aristocrats, monks, and merchants. With the stately vessels and this ordered draping of the red cord over the front of the cart, we can still get some sense of that ritual solemnity, but ultimately frenzy seems to triumph over formality. Other recent gifts speak to the continuing generosity of Princeton's dedicated donors. As a community, we were all saddened to hear of the passing of Dick Danziger this past November. Dick was a dedicated collector of objects related to tea practice. Just before his death, Dick and Peggy very generously donated part of their collection to Princeton, including many magnificent tea objects, and I will mention just two of those here. This wonderful pair of rakuware tea bowls, one with red glaze and one with black, which have been given the names Ikezuki and Surusumi. Many of you in the audience might recognize those names. The tea bowls are named after two horses in the tale of the Heike, from the episode known as the Race Across Uji River. But aside from the tale of the Heike, there are perhaps even more important volumes that you may recognize these tea bowls from, penned by members of our very own community. Ikezuki featured on the cover of Professor Morgan Patelka's groundbreaking book on rakuware, and our host this evening, Amy Poster, also covered the pair in her edited volume, Cross Currents, Masterpieces of East Asian Art from New York Private Collections. Well, these tea bowls are just outside New York now, in the Princeton collection, and they represent superlative examples of rakuware, with many of the characteristics pioneered by the first generation raku potter, Chojiro. And rakuwares are formed by hand without the use of a potter's wheel, and both of these bowls feature the stippled citron skin texture. And both are signed Sonyu, indicating that they were made by the fifth generation head of the raku workshop, who lived in the early 17th century, until the early 17th century. Princeton has a very robust record of training its students in the appreciation of tea aesthetics due to the teaching of Professor Emeritus Andrew Watsky, and these two bowls were made in homage to earlier practitioners, making them an ideal object for study. And the names of teawares can often be abstract and gestural, but not here. The tea bowls and the horses that they are named after are very evocative. So Surusumi, or ground black ink, richly describes its namesake horse's coat and the depths of the black glaze achieved through ground manganese. The name of Minamoto Yoritomo's most formidable steed, Ikezuki, means something like mortal eater, and that name captures that horse's reputedly vicious temper and the raw, visceral reddish-orange of the bowl. The Danziger's gifts to Princeton also include a letter from Honomi Koetsu, and so this Ikezuki is said to be made in homage to Honomi Koetsu's style. And this letter, this note to the Raku workshop that indicates some tea bowls that he had made are ready to be picked up and fired. And this is a valuable record of the direct involvement of certain tea masters in the making of their vessels. These two bowls come with numerous wrappings and boxes within boxes, which is often found with teawares that are known and named and with their own carefully recorded biographies of their making and use. Tea practitioners often keep very detailed records, and in the case of Surusumi and Ikezuki, we can trace their provenance or the history of their ownership back to 1867. And tracing the history of objects is a prerogative that is increasingly affecting all museums, as stricter legislature, increased awareness, and shifting public opinion on who should own what and who gets to say so becomes a bigger part of all of our work. Provenance has a long history at Princeton. Several Princeton graduates and two former directors were among the monuments men who recovered loot after the end of the Second World War. But that is in the past, and the department has recently hired its first curator of provenance, who will be an enormous help in excavating some of these past histories and bringing them to wider public attention, as well as educating students in the methodologies of provenance research. But despite all these changes and expansions, there are many aspects of the museum that stay true to the original proposal as outlined by University President McCosh and his appointees, William Cooper Prime and General George McClellan, back in the late 19th century. Namely, the faculty, the library, and the museum will all be united together in one building, with the Marquand Library occupying one of the pavilions and offices for faculty and museum staff on the third floor, and classrooms, object study rooms, and lecture halls on the first, with the gallery spaces in between. Although those early, more antiquarian collections that distinguished the early years of the museum may not include very many pieces that we would want to highlight for their aesthetic merits alone, there are areas of dense display on the second floor that will allow the inclusion of more of these objects and draw from cross-regional collections. After having been separated into different temporary spaces over the last few years, having the department, the museum, and the library in the same building offers up natural opportunities for collaborative research and display. And we hope that the new building will continue to foster an environment of collaboration between all these different facets of Asian art history at Princeton. For example, our Japanese art history specialist at Marquand Library, Nicole Fabricant-Persson, has planned an exhibition in the library for the spring of 2026 that will show some of the greatest rare books in the Japanese collection at Marquand, ranging from the mid-17th century until the 20th. And some of the works in the Marquand exhibition will be from the Shibui collection, a historic acquisition of 17th century erotic books that were acquired over the course of several recent years. They are part of what survives from a renowned collection amassed in the early 20th century by the art historian and woodblock print specialist Shibui Kiyoshi. And this group of extremely rare items represents the dawn of commercial publishing in Japan and reveals the roots of the woodblock print tradition of ukiyo-e in its very nascent stages. Some of the titles were so rare that Marquand's copies are the only copies still extant. And just in case there are any budding scholars of Shimpon in the audience who are looking for research topics. And you may be asking how such an incredible collection ended up in the US, and I can tell you, after the death of Shibui Kiyoshi in 1992, it seems that his surviving family members were embarrassed about his realm of collecting, shunga, and they wished the collection to be sold overseas, so as to not attract further attention to it in Japan. So someone else's prudishness is our gain. And a stellar example among the works that will be on display is this one, 4 Scenes of Lovemaking. And this is a famous hand scroll fragment, and it is believed to be the earliest extant example of printed ukiyo-e, which had only been represented in painting prior to this point. It is thought to date to around 1660 and is the only extant copy, and this fragment features very well preserved orange and green hand coloration, making it a prototype for the aesthetic found in the first single sheet woodblock prints. And just looking at the time, if I can gratuitously provide one more example, the 2-volume 1802 erotic book, Picture Book of Modern Forms and Figures by Utagawa Toyokuni, shows different women from all different strata of society, and the preface promises that they will range from the most virtuous women to the most immoral. And the many editions and printings of this book suggest that it was extremely popular. However, because it was illegal at this time to portray women of different social classes within the same publication, the book was subject to government censorship. In subsequent printings and later editions, the descriptive information about the women depicted, which can be seen in these small cartouches, was removed. It was carved out from the printing blocks, leaving blank cartouches within the compositions. However, there are rare copies like this one, the first editions, that still have that descriptive information intact. This book also has a much later specially made silk brocade case and handwritten information sheet, which reveal that it was once owned by the French writer and literary critic Edmond de Goncourt, who was instrumental in bringing Japanese art to Europe and promoting it in the late 19th century. The exhibition at Marquand will include works up to the 20th century and avant-garde artist books, so there will be plenty to see. And I mention the exhibition from Marquand's collection as it offers another opportunity for collaboration. As in the museum, we plan to have a parallel display in the Asia galleries at the same time, which is both intended to help promote the library exhibition, but also show how the different collections inflect and enhance one another. So to close, this is JASA's festive program, and since it is the holiday season, I'm going to try and make a tie-in with Charles Dickens's A Christmas Carol. This is going to be flimsy and a stretch, so please bear with me. One of my favorite paintings in the collection is this hanging scroll image of the Zen figures Kanzan and Jitoku, a gift from Kurt Gitter and Alice Yellen that came to the museum in 2020 by the inimitable Soga Shohaku. Known as Hanshan and Shide in China, Kanzan and Jitoku are these semi-legendary figures. Kanzan, who is pictured on the right, seems to have been a Chinese monk in the Tang Dynasty. So he's back to the viewer and he's reading a scroll. He is said to have befriended another man, Jitoku. In some versions, he was another monk. In others, he worked in the kitchen, and in others, he was a janitor. In any case, Jitoku is always depicted with a broom, just as Kanzan always has his scroll. What is important is that both of them were low status, and they became iconoclastic figures in Zen painting, wearing tatty clothing, looking disheveled, and seated among nature, rather than depicted in formal settings practicing ritual. In some interpretations, both figures were thought to be the incarnations of bodhisattvas, Kanzan as an emanation of Monju and Jitoku of Fugen. And even though their backs are turned here, we know exactly who they are. These two men who were such close companions that they became inseparable. Shohaku is one of the most idiosyncratic and talented painters of the 18th century, mingling Kano compositions with his eccentric brushwork styles and interpretations of conventional motifs. His distinctive brushwork style is on display here. We can trace the split fibers of his brush as he varies the ink tonality. Kanzan is sometimes depicted wearing the black robes of a monk, but not always, as sometimes he has the white robes of a scholar. In some depictions, the pair are dressed in the same tattered clothing, but at other times they are oppositional, with one in darker clothing and the other lighter. But Shohaku has gone further here, as it is not just their clothing that contrasts, but the men themselves, as lighter tones have been used to depict Kanzan on the right, compared to the richer blacks of Jitoku on the left. It seems possible that Shohaku is drawing attention to the old idea that Jitoku was actually an incarnation of Kanzan, presenting them as a duality, light and dark, white and black, two sides of the same person. There is a sense of reflection here, looking back on a past faded self. And of course, you can draw a parallel with our topic today, the new museum, a new building that looks back on itself and its history even as it moves forward. But because this is the festive program, one could say that the spectral Kanzan is like the ghost of Christmas past, reviewing his record on his scroll of past joys and sorrows. Jitoku is like the ghost of Christmas future, a dark, silent figure that reveals a bleak future where Scrooge dies alone and unloved. Now, the comparison falls apart here because A Christmas Carol has 4 ghosts and we only have 2, but the message is, of course, about the consequences of our choices, the possibility of redemption, and the spirit of giving at this time of year. At the end of Dickens' story, Scrooge realizes the value of generosity and he buys a goose for the impoverished Cratchit family to celebrate the holidays. Luckily, in Japanese art, we have plenty of geese, and here are just a few that the Princeton Art Museum can offer you tonight. Thank you for your attention and your festive good cheer in indulging some of my nonsense this evening, and I hope that at least some of it has inspired you to visit us next year. Thank you.
Thank you, Kit. I'm sure everyone in the room agrees with me in thanking you for enlightening us with the exciting history of the University Museum, something very few of us had actually studied or heard about. and presenting the stunning new building in a way that we can latch onto immediately. And I'm sure everyone is going to be ready to rush down to see it. But most importantly, you have described what I was going to ask you about, what makes Princeton's collection so compelling. And your approach to the collection tonight was absolutely stunning for us, showing us important new acquisitions, but also the depth of the collection and giving credit to those who preceded you in the field. But I think that's most important is that you're there. And I should say you're here for us and for all of us to know that the University Museum really can be characterized in a way that other museums may not be. You have the opportunity to be so closely connected through the institutions of Princeton. And I did want to ask you how you actually would characterize the experience of the humanism and other facets of the University Museum experience that made you decide that you wanted to be a part of this very important institution.
Thank you. I think it's always exciting to be, well, I'm hoping actually this is going to be the only time it happens, to be part of a brand new museum renovation, because even just coming in at the tail end of it, seeing the amount of work that this takes. But I think it's just an amazing opportunity to look back on the history of a museum and what you're trying to achieve and telegraph about the museum's process and attitude. So that aspect was really compelling. And of course, the opportunity to work with students is something that I'm really looking forward to. And seeing how people's early interactions with objects in the museum end up becoming dissertations and end up becoming their scholarship. And I can say that, Izzy Goldman was the first person who I think 20 years ago told me to work on the Harvard collection of Surimono, which ended up happening. So I think just that opportunity to work so closely with museum collections when you're a graduate student can really be transformative.
Well, I think that while we don't have specific questions here, I would like to ask you while we're waiting to speak about some things you would like to see added to the collection in the future, as acquisitions are very much a part of the world of the museum curator. Do you have some ideas? And I'm sure you were asked when you were there for interviews where you would like to see your future acquisitions for the museum move. And maybe you can share some of those with us.
I can try, as I've only just been here a few, and the caveat to everything that I'm saying is I feel like I only just arrived. And I also haven't had enough of an opportunity to study the collection because moving 100,000 objects, firstly out of the museum in the first place, took about a year, and it's taking the same to move them back in. So they have not been available for me to study. I would love more eccentric 18th century paintings. I might be 30 years too late for that, but we'll see if there's still things out there to collect. That would be something wonderful. And I think there's an opportunity to grow the print collection as well. And also moving into 20th century works would be, I think, something that having the Asia galleries all in that one open plan space means that you can have a lot of dialogues between different cultures and time periods that have not always been something I've been able to do.
The other thing that's so important is that, as you know, there are many, many friends here, many colleagues, but also collectors and burgeoning collectors. And I think that in this period of time, museums really will be relying more and more on new friends coming and attaching themselves to institutions. But you have something that most museums do not have at Princeton. You have very, very generous supporters who have preceded all of us, who've left funds. Our funds have been devoted to the collections, particularly Asian art. And I don't know if you will at one point be able to give us some idea of that, but it's really in the past generation that real new interest has come, particularly through Andy Watsky being at the museum and its wonderful curators over these past years, that there's been a whole new approach to Japanese art. And it's much more expansive, looking into the 20th century as we saw today, and building on the past interests of Japanese prints of those who were perhaps not even in the Asian section, but associated with the museum, who gave their collection and helped the museum acquire. Tonight, we've had the good fortune of meeting you online and in our webinar. And I hope all of you will join us to welcome Kit Brooks into her new job when they open the museum, if not before. And I want to take a moment to wish everybody here tonight a very, very happy holiday season and new year. And to say that as we are closing out 2024, we look forward to welcoming our Zoom community to our 2025 events. Actually, beginning on January 20th with a special talk on the new exhibition, Striking Objects, Contemporary Japanese Metalwork, which will be held, as I mentioned, in January as part of our monthly JASA Zoom series. That exhibition, as I'm quoting from the website of the National Museum of Asian Art, breathes life into traditional methods that have been passed down and practiced over generations. The exhibition highlights works from the esteemed collection of Shirley Z. Johnson, who passed away in recent years. She was a distinguished lawyer, philanthropist, and former board member of the National Museum of Asian Art. And her passion for contemporary Japanese metalwork and her visionary gift have made the museum home to the largest collection of such works in the United States. Our guest speaker for the JASA Zoom on Monday, January 20th, will be Sol Jung, the Shirley Z. Johnson Assistant Curator of Japanese Art. Again, good night to you all, and we look forward to seeing you soon. Happy New Year.